Okay, here we go. Hi, everybody. I'm Rainbow, and welcome to Dimensional Walking. Today, I'm going to be reading from a book that I bought while I was in New Mexico. I've been there for a couple weeks, and it's about a story that I've heard of ever since I was a kid. And she's known as the crying woman, the Wailer, but we know her as La Llorona. And the different stories about her have always been intriguing to me. There's probably some truth based in all of it. But the one thing I know is that the different stories that I heard as a child were a little scary because I was told that she if you saw her, it was a bad omen, it was ill fate, and then she could throw you in the river or the water. And so when I would go fishing with my dad, I'd be weary of her lurking around. But I thought that it would be interesting to read you a story that kind of makes sense. Um, there's there's probably in every folklore that's out there some small hint of truth, about a woman who falls in love with a guy who's callous and horrible and the womanizer or whatever. Or maybe she's just spiteful and maybe she's the problem. But like I said, there's probably some truth in any of that. But in this particular story that I'm going to share with you, it makes more sense why she committed the crime that she did. And it's usually about guilt, not being able to handle what she did to her children by throwing them into the river. So I don't know if she's this lost soul that is destined to wander the world looking for her children. Who knows? I'm going to read the story from this book called Ghost Stories of Arizona and New Mexico. I'm trying to get a glare on there for you so you can see that. And I thought it was kind of the one story that I picked out. I thought it probably was the best story to share with all of you so you can kind of see the story behind the folklore of La Llorona. And I do have a raspy voice. I got a scratchy throat. I'm going to try not to cough, but if I do, bear with me because I probably will cough through this whole story. But I'm going to do my best not to. Okay, so here we go. Not that it's an easy story to tell. There are many wildly varying versions, but they do have some basic elements in common. They all involve a strikingly attractive young woman, an ill-conceived affair with some callous man, a brutal act of can't even talk, infanticide. She did her babies in, let's put it that way. And then the sightings of the woman's tortured spirit unable to come to terms with the act she has committed. Sometimes her name is Maria, sometimes Luisa, other times Malincha. In one popular version, she is an Aztec woman who had the ill fortune of falling for a heartless Spanish conquistador. In other versions, she is a beautiful village girl with humble origins who gets involved with a rakish womanizer, a rich ranchero, or a handsome traveler. In other variations, she is a vain and selfish woman intent on doing anything to hold on to her lover. The end result, though, is always the same. So here's one of the more popular versions of the story of La Llorona. She was born in a humble little Mexican pueblo, and while she was alive, broke the heart of every man who lived there. The luster of her shining black hair and the dark and perfect symmetry of her beautiful face caused every man who saw her to fall for her. And it wasn't her looks alone. She was also imbued with an extraordinary grace, her gentle and refined mannerisms making her something of an outsider in the rough town that was her home. Eyes followed her wherever she walked down the street, and the townsfolk wondered how one of the poorest families in such a poor town produced such a regal beauty. Coveted as she was by every man in the village, such fervent admiration only served to isolate her. Every man wanted her, but no man felt worthy of her. And so it was that this young woman's beauty perpetually set apart from the rest of the townsfolk. It was agreed by everyone that no one in this lowly town of dirt farmers and poor ranchers deserved such extraordinary beauty. Then an adventurer from Mexico City rode into town on a summer's night, wandering the countryside just for the sake of it. He was a big man on a big horse, with a ready laugh and enough money to buy the town. And minutes after he strode into the pueblo's only bar, he had won the esteem of the local sporting man. It was a rare thing for the man of this town to play host to a man of such obvious means. He spent his money without issue, buying rounds for everyone in the bar each time he ordered for himself and losing hand after hand of cards with happy nonchalance, laughing and telling stories of strange places that none of them had seen. In the bar that night, tequila, mirth, and laughter were in no short supply. With the help of his bottomless wallet and his copious losses at the gambling tables, the stranger lit up the establishment. The party went on until the first trace of morning light broke the darkness. The stranger grew suddenly serious. He looked around the dark bar and then spoke. "Thank you, my friends," he said, slurring through the tequila. "You have shown a lone wanderer great hospitality. But the sun has come up now, and it's time for me to go. The horizon calls." "No!" came the drunken shout from the tavern. One man staggered to his feet, saying, "Will you forget this night's brotherhood? You are welcome here, to our town and its treasures, as though it were your own home." "Its treasures," the stranger said with a smile. "Besides the friendship of gallant men, such as yourselves, what kind of treasures do you suppose your town might offer?" "We have a woman here," the man replied, "a woman whose beauty defies every man in this village. I promise you that though you may wander all over this country and the world beyond, you will never see such a beauty as the one that dwells here with us." Shouts of agreement sounded in the bar. All the men were thinking of the woman who had haunted their dreams, and knew that the stranger would likewise be smitten with her first look. And unlike every other sorry, man in the room, the stranger, they knew, with his great wealth and gregarious manner, would not allow himself to be tortured by such a thing of beauty. He would act, here they said to themselves, with someone who was worthy of her. "A woman?" the stranger asked, his intent and interest visibly piqued. It had been a while since he'd enjoyed such company. Many señoritas admired him, yes, but he wasn't the type of man to become entangled with such things. With his lofty pedigree, great wealth, and irresponsible wanderlust, he was in no rush to pick a wife. The road still called to him, and in all his travels he had yet to encounter a woman who would cause him to reconsider his rootless ways. Nevertheless, he had enjoyed himself in this town and was amused at the thought of marching to a woman's home at this hour with such a band of drunks. "Believe me, amigos, I've seen quite a few beautiful señoritas in my day," he finally said with a laugh. "But because you've been such splendid hosts, I will agree to visit this woman you speak of." And so it was with that every man in the bar rose to take the stranger to the woman they adored. For his part, the wanderer took a few minutes to ready himself, shaving his face, twirling his grand mustache into two fine points, and brushing the dust off his sombrero and riding clothes. When he was done, he fell in with his routine of gamblers, his retinue of gamblers, who promptly spilled out into the street, singing and shouting all the way to the humble home of the town's most celebrated woman. The sun had risen, and the roosters were crowing when the crowd arrived. The woman's father was already awake, working on the fence in his front yard. For years the old man had been painfully aware of how coveted his daughter was. He had spent much of his last few years chasing stricken young men with their anonymous love letters from his door. He was forced to cut down the tree in the yard that provided a view into his daughter's bedroom. And when his daughter had complained that she was often woken in the night by amorous whispers from men hiding under her window, he sealed it with shutters that could not be opened. Indeed, when the drunken mob of men arrived, he had been making his fence higher in an attempt to put an end to the obscene letters that were nightly deposited at his doorstep, not knowing that he would not have to worry about the lovelorn and lustful for too much longer. He stopped his hammering and looked at the drunken congregation with open hostility. Has the time finally come? He thought to himself. Had the riffraff he had contended with for so long finally decided enough was enough? Were they here to take his daughter away? He stepped out to meet them, scowling, hammer in hand. What are you doing here at such an early hour, making such a racket and reeking of tequila?" The man who had spoken to the stranger earlier stepped forward and cleared his throat. "We are here, Signor," inflating his voice to absurd proportions, "because a great visitor from abroad has arrived seeking audience with your daughter." The father's scowl deepened. He tightened his grip on his hammer. "A great visitor from abroad?" he said. "Where is this great visitor? I see nothing but drunken fools before me." As this At this, the stranger straightened and stepped forward, an amused grin on his face. "Forgive me, Signor. I should have announced myself. I arrived in your fine town last evening, and have greatly enjoyed the hospitality of these fine friends." A little cheer went up with the drunks. "This morning I was about to go on my way when I was told that this was not a possibility without looking at least once upon the treasure of the town. I have been told that your daughter is the finest among all women, and I would be a fool to leave without meeting her." The father was silent, unsure of what to make of this man standing before him. He was drunk, certainly, but it was obvious by his bearing and quality of his clothes that he was a man of means. The woman's father was not so quick to rebuke this visitor, not only because he was obviously wealthy, but also because he was desperately wanted to see his daughter married. He had grown tired of defending her honor from all the bumbling fools in town, all of whom were cowed by his daughter's beauty. He looked at the stranger and thought, "Here at last is someone who may be worthy of her." So it was that drunken admirers and protective father were thinking along the same lines when the woman herself appeared on the road. She had gone to fetch water from the well and was returning with a full jug on her hip. Her dress was threadbare and patched in places, the hem covered with the dirt of the road. She had been smiling, but her expression dropped upon the taking in of the sight of men crowded around her house, each of them looking at her with a mix of unfathomable hope and impossible expectation that she had long grown accustomed to seeing in the eyes of men. Holding her head high and continuing to her home, did not take notice of the stranger among them, standing a hand or two taller than the rest, with his finely combed mustache, fancy riding clothes, and enormous sombrero. But he noticed her. Indeed, the moment she crested the hill, he ceased noting anything else. By God, they were right, the man thought as he stood agape, unable to believe his eyes. She is the most beautiful woman that I have ever seen. All at once, he knew he had to have her. He would do anything, settle down, give up all his money, even live in this town with these drunken simpletons as his neighbors. "Father," the girl said upon reaching the gate. He was looking at her in a way he never had before. "There is someone I would like you to meet," the father said to his daughter. "He has come from many miles to meet you." At this, the stranger took off his sombrero and stepped forward. He had never been the sort of man to lose his composure, but standing face to face with this woman, he found himself unable to form a single thought. Suddenly terrified that in his wide-eyed silence he might appear indistinguishable from the pitiful mob crowded behind him, the stranger forced words to his mouth. "Señorita," he said, moving closer, "let me take this water from you. It looks like a difficult burden to carry." And with these simple words, the young woman fell in love. Was it the way he spoke, his formal language, setting him apart from the men she had always known? Could it have been that he wore the finest riding clothes she had ever seen? The enormous sombrero tucked under his arm, his lavish mustache? Perhaps it might have had something to do with the fact that he had just looked her in the face and managed to say something, which was more than any man besides her father had been able to accomplish since she had been a child. Whatever it was, she decided then and there she loved this man. So began a short courting period, which led to marriage, a home, and in less than 2 years' time, two children, a baby boy and a baby girl. Yet things were not well in their house. Indeed, their happiness began to crumble not long after they made their vows. Although the young woman's beauty was awe-inspiring, it turned out that it wasn't enough to completely kill the stranger's wanderlust. After all, he had stopped by the town for a night of cards and tequila, and the next time he had a chance to look around, he had built a home for a wife and children he had somehow acquired. The local men were good for one night of inebriation, but it didn't take long for him to grow sick to death of every last one of them. He had barely been married for half a year before he began taking longer and longer trips away from home, inventing any reason he could think of to get away from the tiny town that had accidentally become his home, and his beautiful wife accompanied him on almost none of these excursions. The stranger was the first to admit that there were a few women as fair as his wife, but soon after he was married, he also came to realize that there were more important things than mere beauty. He was from a noble family of considerable wealth, well educated, and used to certain worldliness in his companions. His wife, on the other hand, was a simple girl who had never been outside her village. The man never looked at her the same way after he realized that her company was scarcely better than that of the men at the bar. It did not take long after this realization for their marriage to fall apart. His trips away from town began to grow longer and longer, and when he was in town, it was obvious that his mind was elsewhere. He could barely be bothered with his wife's concerns and found it ever more difficult to contain his frustration with her provincial ways. But no matter what foolishness came out of her mouth, he was never completely unaffected by her beauty, and was never overtly offensive to her. The children, however, were another story. Perhaps because it was impossible for him to vent his frustrations on his wife, his children bore the brunt of all the misgivings he had about his marriage. He took to hollering at the youngsters as if they made so much as a peep. He never looked them in the eye and did not so much as touch either of them. More than once he stormed out of the house in the middle of the night on account of their crying, sometimes not returning for weeks. No one knows how his wife reacted to such slights during this period. She certainly could not have been happy, but even if she was absolutely miserable, the social conventions of her time would not allow her to leave her husband. Such conventions, however, did not exist for men, and her husband ended up leaving her. She did not even know that their marriage was over until the day she saw him with another woman. She was surprised at first when she saw him pull up in a carriage in front of the town's general store. Her husband had always preferred to ride on the horseback, and this was the first time he had come to town in a carriage. Everything was made abundantly clear when he emerged from the carriage with a resplendently dressed woman on his arm. Catching sight of his wife and children at the end of the street, he immediately gave the woman he was with a long kiss. His wife stormed down the street and began shouting, using every word for two-faced liar that she had in her vocabulary. But he just looked at her dumbly. Certainly, Signora, you do not mean to say that we are acquainted, he said, looking from his wife to the two children in her arms. I have never been in this village before, and let me assure you I would never bring up children here. Now, goodbye. The woman lost her mind. She ran home, wailing at the top of her voice the entire way. She remained locked in her house for weeks, refusing to see anyone, not even her mother or father. Isolating herself in her misery, the townsfolk could only guess at what was going on behind closed doors. No one in town could have known how bad it had gotten for her until it was too late. The last time anyone saw her, it was evening, and a violent summer storm was raging. She was seen moving fast down the town's main street, clothed in a long white dress, soaked to the skin, her two children in her arms. Those who saw her only caught the split-second glimpse, illuminated by lightning flashes. Her dark hair was plastered to her face, which was bent into an expression of utter madness. By her look, it wasn't clear whether she was weeping or laughing, but the blood-chilling wail that sounded down the street made it clear enough. Grief had consumed her. The rain was falling so hard that the river nearby had become a rushing torrent, very nearly flowing over its banks. There was one man who saw it happen. He followed her to the river bank and watched in horror as she raised her children one at a time over her head and hurled them with all her might into the river below. The man was shocked as the raving young woman's frenzied hysteria dissolved into manic grief right before his eyes. Realizing the enormity of what she had just done, she fell to her knees and let out a terrible cry that carried above the storm and all through the town. My babies! She cried. With this, she threw herself into the roaring river, casting her life away in those powerful currents, her body never to be found. She was usually seen at night, shimmering and semi-transparent, her own beautiful features gaunt and decimated, her once lively brown eyes sunken into two twin pits. Sometimes she just stood and stared out on the water. On other occasions, witnesses claimed she raised her head to the stars and wailed the same way she did the night she threw her children into the river. So, there you go. that's one of those stories, and it's pretty sad, but probably there's a little bit of truth in that. So it says here, terrifying as these encounters were, no adult who saw her on the banks of the river ever came to any harm. However, it was a completely different matter for any children who had the misfortune of stumbling on Llorona at night. There's no short story about the first child that vanished on the banks of the river, but over the years, it became accepted among the children of the town that to stay out too late on the banks of the river was to risk their own lives. Ever on the search for her own children, La Llorona would settle for others foolish enough to venture near the river after dark, where the woman in white would drag them into the cold black depths. So I mean, it's pretty sad. So despite all of the inconsistencies in all the many stories where she's selfish and she's holding on to her lover, she came from a very poor village. She married a wealthy man who didn't want to be with her anymore, or she married someone who she was never married, but she was with somebody who was a womanizer and just didn't want to be with her anymore and got her pregnant. So it's the the different stories all are about a woman who unfortunately uh, became a mother, and either the guy was horrible or she for some reason lost her mind and she killed her babies. So I think that um, when I was a child, I remember the part about the her going after the children, not so much the adults, but I did hear about her dragging adults in as well. So she supposedly abducts children and takes them down to the murky depth of wherever she's at, yeah, to their deaths. Um, and sometimes you can hear her by a coyote-like cry. I have heard that. I've heard that coyote-like cry, but it's kind of like between a coyote and a human cry. Sometimes I wonder if that's like Dogman or not. But anyways, as you can see with this story, that it was very sad. But that's kind of one of the tales of where that the folklore of La Llorona came from. So, anyways, I hope you enjoyed it. I know I coughed through half of it, and I'm sorry, but I wanted to get something out to you guys because I hadn't been doing videos for a while. So, anyways, I hope you are all doing well. I hope you enjoyed that story as much as you possibly could. That kind of gives you a little glimpse into the legend of her. And, you know, if you're over by a stream or a river late at night, um, be wary of her. She might be around. You never know. So take care. Thank you for watching. And I will see you guys in the next video that I do. I'm not sure when. One will be coming up. Take care.